It's great to welcome back to the program today Dr. John Gartner, who is founder of Duty to Warn and co-editor of Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness in the Mind of Donald Trump. He has taught in the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical Center for 28 years. Dr. Gartner, thanks for joining us again.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me.
So last time you were on, you described and pointed to a number of sort of publicly available instances that you believe raised the serious concern of Donald Trump's both possible cognitive decline and what has been described occasionally as a pre-dementia state. You also discussed some personality issues that you believe are noticeable about the president from publicly available audio, video information. In the months since we've had you on, have your concerns grown or decreased about this issue?
They've grown. They've grown dramatically. I think two things I would point to is one, if you managed to catch his 2-hour CPAC speech, he was openly rambling. It just didn't make sense. It sounded like the wild sort of gyrations and meandering sort of thought disorder of someone who really has something cognitively wrong with them. And I remember when I first started suggesting that he was unfit because of his severe personality disorder, his malignant narcissism, which is the personality disorder that's shared by most murderous dictators. I said, well, it's not like he's openly, flagrantly thought disordered. It's really more this severe personality disorder. But of course, if he were, openly schizophrenic or openly thought disorder, well, then people would think that they could remove him under the 25th Amendment. But anything short of that, they wouldn't even. And now, actually, we are seeing a flagrant thought disorder in the form of this gross cognitive deterioration, and still people are normalizing it. The most recent example, of course, that Colbert was joking about last night was this Tim Apple comment that seems innocuous and funny, but it's actually quite revealing. He's done this many times before, called people by the wrong names. In the fires of California, he said the fires were in Pleasure, California, not Paradise, California. He's mixed up, done malapropisms with people's names about a dozen different times. So the thing about this Tim Apple thing is it's not actually funny. It's actually revealing of someone whose cognitive slippage is getting worse by the day and who's showing it more flagrantly every single day. And people are so entranced with the dear leader that he could literally be a babbling idiot. And then everyone will just normalize it.
So there's people who will hear us and they'll say, you guys aren't talking about dyslexia. Is it possible that if not all, but much of what we're observing could simply be dyslexia?
I know. That's the short answer. He may have dyslexia. I know he can't read. But the reason to suspect cognitive pre-dementia, that is because we're seeing cognitive decline from his earlier baseline. As I said last time I was on the show, if you look at videotapes of him in the 1980s, he's quite articulate. He's got a rich vocabulary. His thought is sophisticated. He speaks in polished paragraphs. Now he can't complete a sentence without derailing into some kind of irrelevancy. He really has trouble finding words. His vocabulary is very thin. He overuses superlatives, which is one of the things we see with people who have dementia. Everything's tremendous or, a shame or, because that just sort of covers a wide multitude of things. So we're seeing a gross deterioration from his own baseline. So for something like dyslexia, that would be something stable that he had his whole life. What we're seeing is someone who's a shadow of his former self in terms of his cognitive functioning.
When it comes to I want to get to the Tim Apple thing in a second, but when it comes to some of these incidents where he has seemingly had trouble pronouncing words, so that there was the God bless the United States and the Jerusalem and that type of thing, which was, we were told, could have been a denture issue, but then really rich people usually don't have dentures, they have implants, and then we were later told he doesn't really have dentures. What do you make of that piece?
No, I think that's a good example. That's also, I think, quite significant. I mean, these are sort of hard neurological signs, these kind of mispronunciations. Also, some of his spelling errors, the smocking gun, and also some of his neologisms. Neologism is a made-up word, like pfeffy. These are really not. These aren't subtle signs of thought disorder. These are the kind of things that if you saw it in your uncle, you'd be sending him to the doctor.
When we go back to the Tim Apple story for a second, one of the things that I'm thinking about is this report from a private meeting at Mar-a-Lago with Republican donors, where he reportedly said that it was fake news. I mean, that he didn't actually say Tim Apple, that he was saying Tim Cook Apple in this sort of quick way, and that it's all completely fabricated. That's almost more disturbing to me in the sense that either he believes he can convince people that that's the case, which shows some kind of disconnection from reality, or he may actually remember it in that way. I don't know if one or the other is more concerning to you.
Well, they're both concerning. And with Donald Trump in general, he is a pathological liar. And he also has delusional thinking. So at any given moment, you're unclear as to whether he's simply telling a lie, which he does, something like done 6,000 times during the time he's been in office, or he's actually just deluded or distorted, disordered in his thinking, and he actually believes some of these crazy, conspiracy theories or what have you. And the thing is it really, I think, is somewhat fluid. I think he actually goes back and forth between simply lying and actually living in a fantasy world. And you're right, both are disturbing. But what's even more disturbing is that both are true.
Have you noticed anything in terms of time of day? There are sometimes considerations or observational differences in people who either have pre-dementia or other cognitive decline, where time of day seems to be a big difference maker in terms of sort of how they're able to comport themselves. Have you observed anything like that with the president?
That's a really fascinating and interesting question. I have not been able to sort of track his behavior, by the hour. But now that you mention it, it would be a good variable for us to pay attention to and try to measure, because I wouldn't be surprised if, as happens with people who have dementia, if not doing some sundowning, where he's getting worse at certain times of the day, especially around sunset. I remember there was that one visual of him not being able to find the car. When he got off the plane, he was sort of wandering around the tarmac, and I think that was around 5 o'clock. People were saying, this looks like my demented uncle, sundowning. We have a lot of examples of that where he seems to be disoriented, on stage. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know who's there. He doesn't remember if Melania is there or not there. And people are kind of steering him, in the right direction, but he looks confused and aimless.
There will be people who listen to or watch this interview who will say, hey, guys, hold on a second. Dr. Gartner has not examined Donald Trump. Dr. Ronnie Jackson did. They did something called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, and Trump passed, right? So how do we evaluate that defense?
No, it's actually an excellent question. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment is really a screening device for gross dementia. It doesn't measure these more subtle signs of cognitive decline. So if you think of a rock rolling downhill, it only goes one way. It only goes down. But if it's halfway down the hill, it's not going to be sensitive. The Montreal test not sensitive enough to catch that level of deterioration. After all, this is someone with an Ivy League education. So his fund of vocabulary, even if he loses 70% of his words, he still has more words than say someone with low average intelligence. If you look at the items on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test, there are things like, can you identify a camel? Can you identify a lion? Can you say 3 numbers backwards? These are the kind of things that can you draw a clock? So these are sort of things that are very, very rudimentary. So you could have someone who's in an advanced stage of cognitive decline, but who hasn't gotten so demented that they need to be institutionalized, that would still pass the Montreal, especially if they started out with a high level of intelligence to begin with. As I said, if you look at the tapes of him, people say, no, we haven't examined him, but we do have him on videotape speaking and behaving. So we have observed behavior. If you look at the way he behaved and spoke in the 80s, he looks like someone who is 2 standard deviations cognitively ahead of where he is right now.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit more, because last time you were on, there were people who, even though we did address it, still were not sort of satisfied with your answer. We've talked about this idea, I don't know if I should call it a standard or a rule or a protocol, whereby mental health professionals should not make assessments about individuals without personally examining them. And you pointed out that unless Donald Trump is effectively playing a character in every audiovisual record, that we can deduce characteristics about reality from the audiovisual record. Can you address that from a sort of mental health standards and guidelines perspective, and then maybe more colloquially?
Well, just to take a step back, so the Goldwater Rule really sprung from a lawsuit in 1964 when Barry Goldwater was running for president, and a magazine, Fact magazine, which is now defunct, did a survey of psychiatrists as to whether he was mentally stable, and this is in the area of Freudian psychiatry. And so many of the psychiatrists said he wasn't, but the explanations they gave is that he had an unresolved Oedipus complex, he'd been scarred by his potty training, he was a latent homosexual, very speculative kinds of ideas. And so I actually interviewed the last living member of the ethics committee from that era, and he said, look, we didn't want people making irresponsible claims about public figures that weren't evidence-based. And that was why they put that rule in. Also, they didn't want to make the profession look foolish or leave it open to lawsuits. But then in the 1980s, we switched to a different diagnostic system, the DSM system, which is based on observable behaviors. All of our diagnostic criteria are based on observable behaviors. Well, we can observe Donald Trump's behavior. We observe him on TV. We've all observed him on TV for hundreds of hours. We observe his social media postings. And also, we have what we call in psychiatry informants, people who have worked in the White House, who have written memoirs or have given interviews describing their observation of his behavior. You know, there was a hashtag 25th Amendment inside joke going on within the within the White House itself of his own aides making, kind of slap your forehead sort of observations about the things that he would do that seem so grossly disordered. So it's not just an act. The people who are closest to him are even more alarmed, apparently, because they do see more close up how disordered his behavior, his personality, and his thinking truly is. So what's important to understand is that the rule was put into place for good reason. People shouldn't make irresponsible public statements, but it wasn't intended to be an overall gag order. And it's not saying that we can't make intelligent inferences about someone's behavior if we can observe their behavior and get information from other people who are observing their behavior. So all of these comments that we're making are based on things that we can see with our own eyes, and that people who up close to him can see with their own eyes.
Dr. Gartner, last thing I want to touch on. I've been making the case that whether or not there is a case for impeachment against the president, at this point, only 20 months from the 2020 election, the most direct path to his removal is just voting for somebody else in November of 2020. Along the same lines, when we think about the 25th Amendment and removal for being unfit, from a purely practical perspective, are you also of the mindset that that is an uphill battle and the most direct path is just voting him out in 2020?
Well, the reason the most direct path for getting rid of him is voting him out in 2020 is because we have the most thoroughly corrupt political party in the history of our nation, the current Republican Party, that would not remove him. Not could he shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, he could commit mass murder on Fifth Avenue, and they would not remove him. This has really become a fascist party who will unite behind the leader no matter how evil, no matter how dishonest, no matter how destructive, no matter how immoral his behavior. And so I think I disagree with Nancy Pelosi in the sense that I think it's actually their constitutional duty to impeach him, given that he is not only committed. Actually, if you read the Constitution, we always talk about high crimes and misdemeanors. I'd like to point out that the Constitution, that's not exactly what it says. It says that a president should be removed for treason, corruption, high crimes, or misdemeanors. High crimes and misdemeanors are the lowest level offenses for which you would impeach someone. Treason and corruption are the highest level offenses. And there is absolutely no doubt that this president has committed treason and that he is the most thoroughly corrupt politician perhaps in the history of our nation. So he meets all four criteria, but most importantly, he meets the more serious criteria. When you have a traitor in the White House, that is an emergency, and I would argue it is the constitutional duty of the Congress to impeach him, whether it's politically popular or not. So I happen to strongly disagree with Nancy Pelosi about that, but I do understand why she's saying it, because practically speaking, the 2020 election is the only way that we will remove him from office.
Dr. John Gartner has been teaching in the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical Center for 28 years, founder of Duty to Warn, and co-editor of Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness in the Mind of Donald Trump. Dr. Gartner, a pleasure as always having you on.
Thank you. Always a pleasure talking to you too.